Hello, my friend. Today I bring you another lost legend from the depths of Middle-earth. Close your eyes, feel the magic surround you. Our journey begins.
The day middle, Earth almost ended before the ring, wore a Tolkien-style epic of Middle-earth. Section 1. Shadowed Beginnings. In the days when the world was yet young in the Third Age, and the memory of Gil-galad's final stand still echoed in the halls of Rivendell like the last notes of a mournful harp, there came a season of unquiet dreams. The leaves turned gold and crimson in Rhovanion, but their beauty held no joy, for even the most ancient of trees seemed to whisper of shadows stirring in places that had long lain still. It was in such a time that Mithrandir, whom men called Gandalf the Grey, felt first the cold touch of a familiar dread upon his heart. He had been walking the borders of the Shire, where the hedgerows grew thick with bramble and the smoke from hobbit holes rose straight and true in the still air. Yet even here, in this most peaceful of lands, something had changed. The very wind seemed to carry whispers from the east, and the stars above grew dim though no cloud obscured their light. The wizard paused beside an old oak that had stood sentinel over the Bywater Road for countless years. Its bark was scarred by time and weather, yet it endured, as all good things must endure in a world where darkness ever seeks to creep back into the light. Gandalf placed his weathered hand upon the tree's rough skin and felt something that made his ancient heart grow heavy with foreboding. "Old friend," he murmured to the oak, his voice barely audible above the rustle of autumn leaves, "what tale do you tell? What shadow has passed this way that makes even your roots tremble?" But the tree gave no answer save the sighing of its branches, and in that silence Gandalf heard more than any words could convey. For silence, he had learned in his long years upon Middle-earth, oft speaks louder than the mightiest thunder, and the absence of song tells tales more terrible than any lament. From his pipe came no smoke that evening, though he lit it thrice. The tobacco, sweet and fragrant from the South Farthing, seemed to have lost its savour, and the familiar comfort of its burning brought him no peace. Instead, he found himself staring eastward, past the borders of the Shire, past the misty mountains, toward lands that lay shrouded not merely in distance but in malice. Something was awakening that should have remained in sleep eternal, something that had tasted defeat at the hands of Gil-galad and Elendil yet had not truly died. In the deepest places of the earth, where even the memory of starlight had never come, a will was stirring, ancient, patient, and filled with a hatred that had grown stronger in the darkness of its dwelling. The wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of ash and iron, though no forge burned for leagues around. Gandalf pulled his grey cloak tighter about his shoulders, but the chill that touched him came not from any earthly cold. It was the touch of malice itself reaching out across the leagues, like fingers of shadow seeking, always seeking, for that which had been lost in the fires of Mount Doom. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the wizard began to walk once more, his staff tapping against the stones of the road with a rhythm as old as his wandering. Each step carried him further from the Shire's peaceful boundaries, yet also deeper into a web of fate that had been weaving itself since the day Isildur failed to cast the ring into the fire. Behind him, the lights of Hobbiton twinkled like earthbound stars, innocent and bright. How little they knew, these simple folk of the darkness that gathered beyond their green hills. How little any of them knew of the price that might yet be demanded of them all. Section 2, A Whisper in the Trees. 3 days' journey from the Shire's borders, where the old forest pressed close to the Brandywine River, Gandalf came upon signs that filled his heart with deeper dread. The trees here were ancient beyond the reckoning of men, their roots drinking deep from streams that had flowed since the elder days. Yet now their leaves fell unseasonably, not with the gentle gold of autumn's blessing, but black and withered, as if touched by some malady of the spirit rather than the flesh. Old Man Willow, that hoary giant whose malice was legendary even among the hobbits of Buckland, stood silent in his usual haunt. But it was not the silence of sleep, or even of watchful malevolence, it was the silence of fear. The great tree's bark was pale, almost grey, and his mighty branches hung limp, as though some vital force had been drained from his ancient heart. "Even you feel it, old enemy," Gandalf whispered, approaching the tree with cautious steps. In all his years of wandering, he had never seen the willow thus, subdued, almost cowering. What shadow passes that makes even your darkness seem but a candle before the sun? The wizard extended his senses, letting his awareness flow out like ripples on still water. The forest around him was not empty. Indeed, it teemed with life, but that life was wrong somehow, twisted. Squirrels chattered in voices too high and sharp. Birds sang melodies that hurt to hear, and even the gurgling of the withywindle seemed discordant, as though the very water forgot its ancient song. It was then that Gandalf heard it, a whisper that came not from any throat or lips, but from the air itself, the earth itself, the very substance of Arda. It spoke in no language that mortals knew, yet its meaning was clear to one who had walked the uttermost west and knew the music of creation. It was a call, vast and imperative, summoning something that had been scattered to gather once more, something that had been weakened to regain its strength. The ring, the ruling ring of Sauron the Deceiver. Gandalf's grip tightened on his staff until his knuckles showed white against the weathered wood. He had suspected, had feared, but to hear the call itself, that was different. That meant the search had begun in earnest, and somewhere in Middle-earth the One Ring was stirring to wakefulness after long slumber. But where? In what hidden place did it lie? The call seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like an echo without source, a scent without wind to carry it. Isildur had been slain at the Gladden Fields, and the ring lost in the waters of Anduin. For nearly 3,000 years it had remained hidden, and the Dark Lord, diminished and formless, had been unable to seek it with his full power. Now that was changing. A shadow passed overhead. Though no cloud marred the pale sky of early morning, Gandalf looked up to see a great bird winging southward. No, not a bird, for its wingspan was too vast, and it flew too high for any creature of flesh and feather. One of the Nazgul, perhaps, though in what form he could not tell. The ringwraiths had been abroad more frequently of late, searching, always searching. The whisper came again, stronger now, and with it came images that burned themselves into the wizard's mind. A golden band, simple and smooth, yet bearing letters of fire that no flame could make visible. A great eye, wreathed in shadow and flame, sweeping across the lands of Middle-earth in tireless search, and somewhere, in a place dark and foul, a power growing that would soon eclipse all the free peoples of the world. Gandalf closed his eyes and let his will reach out, seeking to touch the source of that terrible call. For a moment he felt it, a presence vast and malevolent, stirring in the pits of Barad-dûr, growing stronger with each passing day. Sauron was returning to his ancient seat of power, and with each step of his restoration, the ring called out more loudly to its master. The wizard withdrew his awareness quickly, before that dreadful attention could turn toward him. But in that brief contact he had learned enough to fill his heart with urgency. Time was growing short. The peaceful years since the last alliance were ending, and a new shadow was falling across the world. As he turned away from the old forest and began walking toward the Brandywine Bridge, Gandalf found himself thinking of Rivendell, of the White Council, of all those who stood watch against the darkness. They would need to know of this, and soon. But first he would ride north, to the halls of the dwarves and the kingdoms of men, to see what other signs of awakening evil he might find. Behind him, Old Man Willow rustled his leaves with a sound like weeping, and the forest fell deeper into its unnatural silence. Section 3. The Lone Rider. Northward through the wild lands Gandalf rode, his grey horse Shadowfax carrying him swift as thought, across moor and fell. They had met at the borders of Rohan, steed and rider drawn together by bonds older than memory, and now they moved as one through the gathering darkness of the world. The days were shortening, though it was yet early in the season for such swift change. Each dawn seemed dimmer than the last, and the sun itself appeared wan and distant, as though a veil had been drawn across its face. Even Shadowfax, mightiest of the Miaras, seemed to feel the weight of the shadow, his proud head held lower than was his wont, his pace urgent but somehow reluctant. They passed through lands that Gandalf had known for centuries, the brown hills of Dunland, where the proud descendants of the First Men still dwelt in their ancient strongholds, the Gap of Rohan, where the wind sang mournful songs through the standing stones of forgotten kings, and the borders of Fangorn Forest, where the oldest of trees kept watch over secrets too terrible for the light of day. It was at the eaves of Fangorn that Gandalf first encountered another sign of the growing malice in the world. The Ents, those ancient shepherds of the trees, had always been wary of the Grey Pilgrim, but never hostile. Now, as he rode near the forest's edge, he heard the deep resonant voices of the tree herders, raised in what could only be described as lamentation. Hum, came the bass note of Treebeard himself, eldest of all the Ents, his voice carrying clearly across the still air. The trees are troubled, very troubled indeed. Something walks that should not walk, something wakes that should not wake. But this is dark news indeed. Gandalf guided Shadowfax to the very edge of the forest, where the great trees cast shadows deep and cool even in the pale sunlight. Fangorn, he called, using the ancient name with all the respect it deserved. I would speak with you, if you will grant me audience. There was a long silence, filled only with the whisper of leaves and the distant creaking of mighty trunks. Then, slowly the trees began to part, creating a path just wide enough for horse and rider. At its end stood Treebeard, his bark-like skin grey with age, his deep eyes bright with concern. Gandalf Greyhame, the Ent rumbled, his voice like the sound of wind through autumn branches. Long has it been since you walked beneath my eaves, but I think you come not for pleasure in these dark days. There are shadows moving that have not moved for an age of the world. You feel it too then, Gandalf said, dismounting from Shadowfax and approaching the ancient tree shepherd with reverence. The stirring in the east, the whispers in the wind. Tell me, old friend, what do your trees say of this darkness? Treebeard's great eyes fixed on the wizard with an intensity that spoke of deep worry. They say many things, and none of them good. The oaks speak of a burning that comes from afar, though no flame has touched their bark. The birches whisper of a great eye that searches, always searches, though what it seeks they cannot say. And the willows... Here the Ent paused, his voice growing deeper with sorrow. The willows weep for waters that run black with malice, though the springs that feed them are yet clear. The wizard nodded gravely. Each word confirmed what he had begun to fear, that Sauron's power was indeed growing, reaching out across all the lands of Middle-earth like a vast web of corruption. Have you seen aught else? Riders in the night, perhaps, or birds that fly too high and dark to be natural? Yes, there have been such things, Treebeard replied, his branches rustling with unease. Black riders on horses swift as storm wind, and great winged shadows that blot out the stars. They pass northward, ever northward, as though drawn by some call we cannot hear. Northward, Gandalf mused, his weathered face creased with thought. Toward the grey mountains, or beyond them to the wastes of the north. What could draw them there, unless... His voice trailed off as a terrible possibility occurred to him. Unless what, Gandalf Stormcrow? Treebeard asked, leaning forward with the slow deliberation of his kind. Unless they seek not just the ring itself, but some other thing of power, the wizard replied slowly. Some artifact or place that might aid in their search, or... He paused, struck by an even darker thought, or someone who might know where the ring has gone. The implications of this possibility filled Gandalf with urgent dread. If the Nine were indeed riding north, it could mean that Sauron had learned something, discovered some clue that had escaped him for the long years of his diminishment. The thought of what the Nazgul might do to extract information from any who possessed it was too terrible to contemplate. I must away, Gandalf said suddenly, mounting Shadowfax once more. Thank you, Fangorn, for your counsel. Guard your trees well in the days to come, for I fear the shadow will grow darker before it lifts. Fare you well, Gandalf Greyhame, Treebeard replied, his voice heavy with foreboding. May the light guide your steps in the darkness that comes. As horse and rider galloped away from the forest's edge, the Ent's voice followed them on the wind. Beware the north, Stormcrow. Beware the places where the old evils sleep, for they wake more easily now than ever before. Section 4. Dol Guldur in the distance. 7 days' hard riding brought Gandalf to the borders of Mirkwood, where the forest pressed dark and close against the running waters of Anduin. Here the very air seemed thick with malice, and even Shadowfax snorted nervously, his ears laid back against the oppressive atmosphere that hung over the land like a shroud. It had been nearly a century since the White Council had driven the necromancer from his stronghold in the southern reaches of the Great Forest, yet the corruption lingered still. The trees grew twisted and black, their branches intertwined like grasping fingers, and no bird sang in their shadow. Even the river seemed muted here, its voice reduced to a whisper as it flowed past shores stained with the memory of ancient evil. But it was not the lingering taint of Mirkwood that brought Gandalf to this desolate place. It was what he could see rising in the distance, across the dark waters of the river, the hill of Dol Guldur, crowned once more with a fortress of black stone. The sight struck the wizard like a physical blow. When the White Council had assaulted the necromancer's stronghold, they had torn down its walls and cast down its towers, leaving nothing but rubble and broken stone. Yet now, impossibly, the fortress stood again, its battlements sharp against the grey sky, its gates yawning like the mouth of some great beast. "It cannot be," Gandalf whispered, but even as he spoke the words he knew they were false. It could be, and it was. Somehow, the Dark Lord had found the strength to rebuild his ancient seat of power, to raise again the walls that had taken centuries to construct and mere hours to destroy. Shadowfax pawed the ground restlessly, sensing his rider's distress. The great horse had borne Gandalf through many perils, but even he seemed to quail before the malevolent presence that radiated from the distant hill. Dark smoke rose from the fortress's towers, not the clean smoke of honest fires, but the thick, choking fumes of sorcery and corruption. As Gandalf watched, a great shape detached itself from the highest tower and began to circle the fortress, one of the fell beasts that the Nazgul rode, its leathery wings beating slowly against the poisoned air. Even at this distance, the wizard could feel its searching gaze sweeping the landscape, and he urged Shadowfax back into the shelter of the tree line. "How long?" he wondered aloud. "How long has this been building while we sat in our halls, believing the threat ended?" For it was clear that the reconstruction of Dol Guldur was no recent work. The stones were set too perfectly, the towers rose too high, for this to be the labour of mere months or even years. The implications were staggering. If Sauron had been able to rebuild his stronghold without the knowledge of the White Council, what else might he have accomplished in secret? What other preparations might he have made for his return to power? A chill wind rose from the direction of the fortress, carrying with it scents that made Gandalf's nose wrinkle in disgust. The smell of forge fires and molten metal, of decay and corruption, and underneath it all the acrid stench of fear. Whatever was taking place within those black walls, it boded ill for all the free peoples of Middle-earth. The wizard closed his eyes and extended his senses toward the distant hill, trying to gauge the strength of the power that dwelt there. Immediately he recoiled as if burned. The malevolence that radiated from Dol Guldur was like a furnace of hatred, vast and implacable. But more than that, it was familiar. This was not some lesser evil that had taken up residence in the ruins, but the necromancer himself, returned to his old haunts with power greater than ever before. "Sauron," Gandalf breathed, and the name seemed to hang in the air like a curse. The Dark Lord had indeed returned to physical form, had rebuilt his strength until he could once again inhabit a fortress and work his will upon the world. And if he was here, in Dol Guldur, then Barad-dûr itself might already be rising again in the fires of Mount Doom. A great weariness settled upon the wizard's shoulders as he contemplated the task ahead. He had thought, they had all thought, that the victory of the last alliance had bought them time, centuries, perhaps millennia, before the shadow would rise again. But they had been deceived. Sauron's defeat had been neither as complete nor as lasting as they had hoped. The sound of wings overhead made Gandalf look up sharply. Another of the fell beasts was approaching, this one bearing a rider cloaked in black. One of the 9, beyond doubt, and it was flying directly toward his hiding place among the trees. Somehow, despite his caution, he had been detected. Without hesitation, Gandalf spurred Shadowfax into motion. The great horse leaped forward like an arrow from a bow, carrying his rider away from the tree line and north along the banks of Anduin. Behind them, the Nazgul's mount gave a terrible cry that echoed across the water, but Shadowfax was swifter than the wind itself, and soon they had left their pursuer far behind. But the damage was done. Sauron now knew that his return had been discovered, and the element of surprise was lost. The wizard could only hope that he would have time to warn the White Council before the shadow fell upon them all. Section 5. Into the Black. Against all wisdom, against every instinct that had kept him alive through the long years of his wandering, Gandalf turned Shadowfax back toward Dol Guldur. He could not leave without learning more of the enemy's strength, could not return to his allies with nothing but the news of the fortress's rebuilding. Too much hung in the balance, and knowledge, however dangerous to obtain, might yet prove the key to salvation. He waited until the deep hours of the night, when even the fell beasts had returned to their roosts and the guards upon the walls were few. Then, leaving Shadowfax hidden in a grove of withered elms, he made his way on foot to the banks of Anduin. The water ran black and silent here, reflecting no starlight, and when he stepped into its flow it seemed to cling to him like oil. The crossing was a torment of cold and fear. With each step deeper into the corrupted stream, Gandalf felt the weight of malice pressing down upon him like a physical thing. The water whispered with voices he dared not try to understand, and shapes moved beneath its surface that were best left unseen. Only by focusing his will entirely on the far shore was he able to complete the crossing without fleeing back to safety. The hill of Dol Guldur rose before him like a great burial mound, its slopes covered with stunted trees and patches of ground where nothing would grow. The fortress itself loomed, against the stars, its walls seeming to drink in what little light remained in the world. No banner flew from its towers, for what need had Sauron of such displays? His presence alone was banner enough. Gandalf began the ascent, moving from shadow to shadow with all the stealth his long years of wandering had taught him. The path wound back and forth across the hillside, deliberately confusing, and more than once he found himself facing what appeared to be a solid wall of stone, only to discover a hidden entrance or passage at the last moment. The very stones seemed to watch him as he climbed. They had been carved with symbols that hurt to look upon directly, sigils of power that spoke of dominion and darkness. Some were of black marble veined with red, as though blood had been mixed with the mortar, while others appeared to be fashioned from metals that gleamed with their own inner fire. At last he reached the outer courtyard of the fortress, a vast space paved with stones that felt warm beneath his feet despite the chill of the night. At its centre stood a well, but instead of water, it contained a pool of liquid shadow that seemed to move with a life of its own. The sight of it made Gandalf's stomach turn, for he recognised it as one of the Palantiri, not a seeing stone as the Númenóreans had made them, but something far more sinister, a window into the void itself. From the well came whispers in the black speech, words of power and binding that made the wizard press his hands to his ears in a futile attempt to block them out. But even that brought no relief, for the words seemed to bypass his hearing entirely, speaking directly to the deepest parts of his mind. It was then that he saw the first of the prisoners. They hung in cages of black iron suspended from the walls of the courtyard. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. Men, elves, even a few dwarves, all reduced to husks of their former selves, their eyes vacant with despair. Some had been there so long that their hair had grown white, while others bore fresh wounds that spoke of recent capture. One figure in particular caught Gandalf's attention, an elf lord whose noble features were still recognisable despite the ravages of his imprisonment. His robes, though tattered and stained, bore the emblems of Gil-galad's house, and suddenly the wizard understood with horrible clarity why Sauron had returned to Dol Guldur. Elrond's kinsman, he whispered, recognising the prisoner as one of the few survivors of the last alliance who had been present at the cutting of the ring from Sauron's hand. He seeks knowledge of that day, knowledge of what became of Isildur and his burden. The implications were staggering. If Sauron could extract from this prisoner the details of the ring's loss, he might be able to narrow his search considerably. The Elf Lord would know of Isildur's route to the north, of the Gladden fields where he had been ambushed, of all the circumstances that might provide clues to the ring's current location. A sound from within the fortress made Gandalf freeze in terror. Footsteps were approaching, not the measured tread of guards, but something far worse. Each step seemed to shake the very foundations of the hill, and with each one came a wave of malice so intense that the wizard could barely remain standing. He was coming. Sauron himself was approaching the courtyard, drawn perhaps by some sense of intrusion, some awareness that an uninvited guest walked his halls. Gandalf looked desperately for a place to hide, but the courtyard offered little shelter, and already he could see a red glow beginning to emanate from the great doors that led into the fortress's heart. With no other choice, the wizard pressed himself against the base of one of the prisoner cages, hoping that its iron bars might shield him from detection. Above his head, the Elf Lord stirred slightly, his dulled eyes focusing with difficulty on the figure below. "Mithrandir?" the prisoner whispered, his voice barely audible. "Is it truly you? Or do I dream once more of rescue that will never come?" "Be silent," Gandalf hissed, but it was too late. The doors of the fortress burst open with a sound like thunder, and a figure strode out into the courtyard. Tall beyond the measure of men, clad in black armour that seemed to drink in the starlight, and crowned with a helm from which no face could be seen, Sauron had returned indeed, and his power was greater than ever before. Section 6. The Captive King. The Dark Lord stood in the centre of his courtyard like a monument to malice itself, his armoured form radiating a power that made the very air shimmer with heat. Though no features could be seen beneath his great helm, Gandalf felt the weight of that terrible gaze as it swept across the courtyard, searching for the source of the disturbance it had sensed. "Who walks uninvited in my halls?" Sauron's voice was like the rumble of distant thunder, echoing off the black walls with a resonance that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hill. "What fool dares to trespass in the domain of the Lord of Mordor?" From his hiding place beneath the cage, Gandalf remained motionless, barely daring to breathe. Above him, the Elf Lord had lapsed back into the stupor of despair that had sustained him through his long captivity, giving no sign that he had spoken. But the wizard knew it was only a matter of time before Sauron's enhanced senses detected his presence. The Dark Lord began to pace the courtyard with slow, deliberate steps, each footfall ringing against the black stones like the tolling of a great bell. As he moved, the prisoners in their cages began to stir and whimper, their broken minds responding to the proximity of their tormentor with instinctive terror. "I smell fear," Sauron mused, his voice carrying easily across the open space. "Fear and something else. Wisdom, perhaps? Yes, wisdom grown old and grey, wisdom that has wandered far and seen much." He paused directly in front of the cage where Gandalf hid, and the wizard felt certain that discovery was inevitable. But instead of looking down, the Dark Lord turned his attention to the imprisoned Elf Lord above. With a gesture of his gauntleted hand, he caused the cage to descend until it hung at eye level, bringing its occupant face to face with his captor. "Glorfindel of the House of the Golden Flower," Sauron said, and there was a note of cruel satisfaction in his voice. "How long have you graced my hospitality now? 50 years? 100? Time moves strangely in this place, does it not?" The Elf Lord raised his head with visible effort, his eyes focusing on the dark helm before him. Despite his long torment, there was still a flicker of defiance in his gaze, a spark of the nobility that had once made him a terror to the servants of darkness. "I have told you nothing," Glorfindel whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I will tell you nothing. My people did not die in vain at the Black Gate, and their sacrifice will not be betrayed by my weakness." Sauron laughed, a sound like grinding stone that made even the black walls seem to shudder. "Your people? Your people are dust, Elf Lord. Dust and memory fading with each passing year. Gil-galad is gone, Elendil is gone, and even now the kingdoms of men crumble, while the Elder prepare for their final departure across the sea. What loyalty do you owe to ghosts?" "More than you could ever understand," Glorfindel replied, and though his body was broken, his spirit remained unbowed. "For we remember what you have forgotten in your malice, that some things are worth more than power, more than dominion. Love, hope, the laughter of children, these are the true treasures of the world, and they will endure long after your shadow has passed away." The Dark Lord's form seemed to grow larger at these words, his armour glowing with a heat that made the air around him shimmer like a forge fire. Pretty words from one who hangs in a cage like a songbird, but words will not save you, nor will they save those you seek to protect. I have other means of extracting what I require. He raised his hand, and from his fingers came a light that was not light, but its opposite, a radiance of darkness that hurt to look upon and seemed to drain the warmth from everything it touched. Under its influence, Glorfindel began to writhe in agony, his noble features contorting as visions of horror played across his mind. "You were there," Sauron continued, his voice now soft and hypnotic. You stood beside Gil-galad when my master's ring was cut from my hand. You saw what Isildur did with it, where he went when he left Mount Doom. Tell me, Elf Lord, what became of the ruling ring?" Despite the agony that racked his form, Glorfindel managed to speak through gritted teeth. "I saw nothing. Isildur claimed it for his own, but where he took it after..." His voice trailed off in a scream of pain as Sauron's dark light intensified. "Where?" the Dark Lord demanded, his patience finally wearing thin. "The Gladden Fields, the Carrock, the halls of Thranduil? I know he never reached Gondor, for I have ways of learning such things. But what happened to him on his journey north? What became of my precious?" From his hiding place, Gandalf watched in horror as the torture continued. He longed to intervene, to strike out at the tormentor and free the prisoner, but he knew that to reveal himself would mean death for both of them. And yet, to watch such suffering without acting seemed a betrayal of everything he had sworn to protect. It was then that Glorfindel's eyes met his own through the bars of the cage, and the Elf Lord gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Not yet," that gesture seemed to say. "Not while you can still carry word of this evil to those who might stop it." With tremendous effort, Glorfindel straightened in his bonds and looked directly into the eyeless helm of his tormentor. "You will learn nothing from me, Sauron Deceiver. I go now to the halls of Mandos, where even your malice cannot follow." And before the Dark Lord could prevent it, the Elf Lord spoke a word in the ancient tongue of Valinor, a word of unbinding and release. His body went limp in its chains, his spirit departing for the Undying Lands with a speed that not even Sauron's power could match. The roar of rage that erupted from the Dark Lord shook the very foundations of Dol Guldur, and in that moment of distraction, Gandalf slipped away into the shadows, carrying with him the knowledge that Middle-earth's darkest hour was fast approaching. Section 7. The Necromancer's Voice. In the aftermath of Glorfindel's escape into death, the fury of the Dark Lord was terrible to behold. His voice echoed through the halls of Dol Guldur like the cry of a wounded beast, and the very stones of the fortress seemed to recoil from the intensity of his rage. Windows shattered, iron gates twisted in their frames, and several of the weaker prisoners simply died from terror. Gandalf pressed himself deeper into the shadows of an archway, watching as Sauron stalked through his courtyard like a caged wolf. The Dark Lord's form seemed to flicker and shift, at times appearing as the armoured figure he had been, at others becoming something far more terrible, a shadow with eyes of fire, a presence that was felt rather than seen. "Guards!" Sauron's voice boomed across the fortress. "Search every corner, every cell, every shadow. Someone witnessed my discourse with the Elf Lord, someone who should not have been here. Find them." The response was immediate and overwhelming. From every doorway and gateway came the sound of marching feet. Not the boots of men, but the iron-shod claws of orcs and the padding of darker things that preferred not to show themselves in any light. Torches flared to life throughout the courtyard, driving back the friendly darkness that had concealed the wizard's presence. But even as the net closed around him, Gandalf found his attention drawn to something far more significant than his own peril. In his rage, Sauron had allowed his true thoughts to surface, and the wizard could sense them like whispers on the wind. The Dark Lord was closer to finding the ring than anyone had suspected, close enough that the loss of one source of information, however valuable, was merely a frustration rather than a true setback. "The Gladden Fields," came the echo of Sauron's thoughts. "Yes, that is where the trail grows cold. But there are other ways, other paths to knowledge. The river itself remembers, and those who dwell beneath its waters have long memories indeed." A chill ran through Gandalf's heart as he grasped the implication. The Dark Lord meant to question the very waters of Anduin, to seek among the creatures of the deep for witnesses to Isildur's final journey. And if such witnesses existed, the ancient fish, the water spirits, even the stones of the riverbed itself, then the ring's hiding place might soon be revealed. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and Gandalf knew his time was running short. With infinite care, he began to retreat deeper into the fortress, seeking a way to escape that would not lead his pursuers back towards Shadowfax. The great horse was too valuable to risk, and besides, someone had to carry word of this night's discoveries to the White Council. As he moved through the twisting corridors of Dol Guldur, the wizard saw sights that would haunt his dreams for years to come. In one chamber, great maps covered every wall, marked with symbols that showed the movement of armies and the locations of strategic resources. In another, forges burned day and night, producing weapons and armour in quantities that spoke of preparations for war on a massive scale. But it was in the deepest part of the fortress that Gandalf encountered the most disturbing sight of all. Here, in a chamber lit by flames that gave no warmth, stood 9 thrones arranged in a circle around a pool of liquid darkness. 8 of the thrones were occupied by figures in black robes, their faces hidden beneath deep hoods, while the 9th stood empty, waiting, perhaps, for its occupant to return from some dark errand. The Nazgul were in council, and their whispered words carried clearly in the still air. "The search widens, my lord," spoke one in a voice like wind through dead leaves. "Our agents scour every village, every crossroads, seeking word of the ring's passage." "The river folk grow restless," added another. "They sense our presence in their waters and flee to deeper places, but we will find them in time." "Time," hissed a third. "Always it comes back to time. How long before the Wizards' Council discovers our return? How long before they move against us?" At these words, Gandalf felt his blood turn to ice. The 9 knew of his presence here, knew that discovery was inevitable. They were racing against time, seeking to find the ring before the forces of light could mobilize against them. "Let them discover us," came a voice from the empty throne, though no figure sat upon it. The words seemed to rise from the pool of darkness itself, carrying with them the authority of ultimate malice. "What can they do? Drive us from this place again? We will rebuild, as we have always rebuilt. But if we find the ring first, if we restore it to our master's hand, then no force in Middle-earth will be able to stand against us." The wizard had heard enough. Moving with all the stealth at his command, he began to retreat from the Chamber of the 9. But as he reached the doorway, disaster struck. His foot caught against a loose stone, sending it clattering across the floor with a sound that seemed to echo like thunder in the silence. Instantly, all 9 of the hooded figures turned toward the doorway, and Gandalf felt the weight of their combined attention like a physical blow. Red eyes gleamed beneath their hoods, and their voices rose in a terrible harmony. "The Grey Pilgrim! He has heard too much, learned too much. Take him." Section 8. Fire in the darkness. What followed was a flight through darkness that tested even Gandalf's considerable powers. Behind him came the 9, their black robes billowing as they glided through the corridors of Dol Guldur with inhuman speed. Their voices rose in pursuit, chanting words in the black speech that made the very stones of the fortress seem to writhe and twist. But Gandalf was not defenceless. As he ran, his staff began to glow with a pure white light that drove back the shadows and caused his pursuers to shriek with pain and rage. The light of Valinor burned within that simple wooden rod, a flame that had been kindled in the uttermost west and could not be quenched by any power of darkness. "You shall not pass," the wizard cried, turning at a junction of corridors to face his pursuers. He raised his staff high, and the light that blazed from it became like a star fallen to earth, filling the entire passage with radiance. The Nazgul recoiled as if struck, their forms wavering like smoke in a strong wind. But they did not flee. Instead, they began to circle him, 9 shadows moving just beyond the reach of his light, seeking a weakness in his defense. "Fool of a Took," hissed one of them, and Gandalf was startled to recognize the voice, or rather, the echo of a voice he had once known. This had been a king of men once, before the rings of power had claimed him. "Do you think your little flame can stand against the power of the 9? "I think," Gandalf replied, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped his heart, "that flame has ever been the enemy of shadow, and I am not defenceless." He spoke a word in Quenya, the ancient tongue of the Eldar, and the light of his staff suddenly blazed forth like a beacon. The Nazgul screamed and fled before it, their forms dissolving into wisps of shadow that fled down the dark corridors. But Gandalf knew this victory was temporary. Already he could hear new sounds echoing through the fortress, the howling of wargs, the beat of fell wings, the tramp of iron-shod feet. All of Dol Guldur was awakening to hunt him, and even his power would not be enough to fight them all. He ran on, seeking the way he had entered, but the corridors seemed to shift and change around him. Passages that had led upward now sloped down into deeper darkness, and doors that had been open now stood barred with iron. The fortress itself was working against him, bending its architecture to trap the intruder within its walls. It was then that he heard it, a sound that made his heart leap with desperate hope. From somewhere far above came the neighing of a horse, wild and free and filled with urgent summons. Shadowfax had come for him, somehow sensing his master's peril despite the walls of stone and sorcery that lay between them. Following that beloved sound, Gandalf found a stairway that led upward, its steps worn smooth by centuries of the use. He climbed quickly, his staff still blazing with protective light, while behind him the sounds of pursuit grew ever louder. The Nazgul had recovered from their temporary defeat and were following his trail, joined now by dozens of lesser servants of the darkness. At last, he emerged onto one of the fortress's high balconies, where the night air was sweet with the promise of freedom. Below him, the hill of Dol Guldur fell away in a series of terraces and slopes, while beyond lay the dark waters of Anduin, and, on the far shore, the blessed sight of Shadowfax waiting in the moonlight. But between Gandalf and freedom lay a gulf that seemed impossible to cross. The balcony jutted out from the fortress wall like a stone tongue, with no stairs or paths leading down from it, and even as he watched, dark shapes began to emerge from the doorway behind him, orcs with cruel blades, wargs with slavering jaws, and leading them all, the terrible forms of the Nine. "Surrender, wizard," called the Witch King, foremost of the Nazgul, his voice echoing strangely in the open air. "Your flight ends here, there is nowhere left to run." Gandalf looked down at the sheer drop before him, then back at his approaching enemies. For a moment despair touched his heart, and he wondered if this was indeed the end of his long road. But then he heard again the neighing of Shadowfax, wild and free, and suddenly he knew what he must do. "You are wrong," he said to the Witch King, his voice carrying clearly across the night air. "There is always somewhere to run, for those who have the courage to leap." And with that, Gandalf stepped forward off the balcony and into the empty air, his staff blazing like a falling star as he plummeted toward the dark waters below. Section 9. Return to the Wise. The council chamber in Rivendell had not seen such a gathering for many years. Around the curved table sat the mightiest of the wise, Elrond Half-Elven, master of the Hidden Valley, Galadriel of Lothlorien, fairest and most terrible of the Eldar who remained in Middle-earth, Círdan the Shipwright from the Grey Havens, and Saruman the White, chief of the Order of Wizards. It was 3 days since Gandalf had arrived, waterlogged and exhausted, carried to safety by the incomparable Shadowfax after his desperate leap from Dol Guldur. The great horse had somehow known to be waiting in the shallows of Anduin, and together they had escaped the wrath of the Nine. But the news the Grey Pilgrim brought was darker than any shadow that had fallen upon Middle-earth in an age. "You're certain of what you saw?" Elrond asked, his ageless face grave with concern. "Dol Guldur rebuilt, Sauron returned to physical form, the Nine gathered in council. These are tidings that shake the very foundations of our hopes." Gandalf nodded wearily. His grey robes were still damp from his plunge into the river, and there was a haunted look in his eyes that spoke of horrors witnessed and barely escaped. "I saw it all, my lords. The fortress stands as strong as ever it did, and the necromancer who dwells there is no less a spirit, but Sauron himself in all his malice." "And he seeks the ring," Galadriel said, her voice like silver bells touched with sorrow. Her mirror-bright eyes seemed to look beyond the walls of the chamber, seeing possibilities and futures that filled her with dread. "After all these years of silence, he has found the strength to search in earnest." "The question," Saruman interjected, his voice smooth and reasonable, "is whether we should be concerned with his searching. The ring has been lost for nearly 3,000 years. What hope has he of finding it now, when it might lie at the bottom of the sea or be buried beneath leagues of earth and stone?" It was Círdan who answered, the ancient mariner's weathered face creased with thought. "Hope enough to rebuild Dol Guldur and gather the Nine to his side. Hope enough to torture the survivors of the last alliance for whatever knowledge they might possess. This is not the action of one who searches blindly, but of one who has found some clue, some trail to follow." "The river," Gandalf said suddenly, sitting up straighter in his chair. I heard him speak of questioning the waters themselves, of seeking among the deep dwellers for witnesses to Isildur's fate. If such creatures exist, if they remember what befell the ring-bearer at the Gladden Fields. He left the sentence unfinished, but all understood its implication. If Sauron could learn the precise location where the ring had been lost, he might be able to narrow his search considerably. And with the power he now commanded, even the riverbed itself could be made to yield its secrets. Then we must act, Elrond declared, his voice carrying the authority of one who had stood beside Gil-galad at the Black Gate. The White Council was formed for this very purpose, to stand against the shadow when it rose again. We cannot wait for Sauron to complete his preparations. Act, yes, Saruman agreed. But how? Do we assault Dol Guldur again? Drive him from his stronghold once more? He will only rebuild as he has already done, and each time he returns he is stronger than before. Galadriel's eyes flashed with an inner light, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of prophecy. There is another way. If we cannot prevent him from seeking the ring, perhaps we can find it first. The waters of Anduin run through many lands, and those who dwell beside them have long memories. If we can discover where the ring lies before Sauron does... A race against time and tide, Círdan mused. Dangerous, for if we fail, we will have revealed our own interest in the ring's recovery. Sauron will know that we know, and his responses will be swift and terrible. His responses will be swift and terrible regardless, Gandalf pointed out. The Nine are already abroad, searching and questioning. It is only a matter of time before they learn what they seek to know. At least if we act now, we have some chance of success. The debate continued through the night and into the following day, with arguments both for and against the proposed course of action. Some favoured a direct assault on Dol Guldur, others counselled patience and watchful waiting. But in the end, it was Elrond who spoke the words that would shape the fate of Middle-earth. We will search for the ring, but not as Sauron searches, with fire and fear and the pain of innocence. We will send messengers to all the free peoples asking for their aid in this quest. We will seek not just the ring itself, but knowledge of it, tales and rumours that might guide our steps. And if we find it, Saruman asked, what then? Do we destroy it ourselves? Use it against its maker? Hide it in some place even more secure than its current resting place? The question hung in the air like a sword over their heads, for all knew that no simple answer existed. The ring could not be destroyed save in the fires where it was made, and Mount Doom lay in the very heart of Sauron's domain. To use it would be to become like Sauron himself, corrupted by its power. And to hide it would be merely to postpone the day of reckoning. We will decide that when the time comes, Elrond said finally. For now, we must focus on the search itself. Time is our enemy, and with each passing day, Sauron's power grows while our own resources remain fixed. As the council dispersed, Gandalf lingered behind, his thoughts troubled by all he had seen and heard. The path ahead was dark and uncertain, filled with perils that might destroy them all. But there was no choice but to walk it, for the alternative, a world under the dominion of the Dark Lord, was too terrible to contemplate. Outside the council chamber, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient, courses indifferent to the struggles of the earthbound, but somewhere among them perhaps the Valar themselves were watching, waiting to see if the free peoples of Middle-earth would prove worthy of the light they claimed to serve. Section 10. Stirring the northward travelled swiftly through the hidden paths known only to the wise, carried by eagles soaring high above the mountains, and by riders whose horses were fleeter than the wind. From Rivendell the summons went forth, to the halls of the dwarves beneath the lonely mountain, to the woodland realm of Thranduil, to the towers of Minas Tirith, where the stewards of Gondor kept their ancient watch. But it was northward that Gandalf himself rode, toward the halls of Erebor where Dain Ironfoot now ruled the kingdom that his cousin Thorin had died to reclaim. The lonely mountain rose before him like a great stone throne, its peak crowned with the crystalline formations that gave it its name, and from its gates came the sound of hammers ringing on anvils as the dwarves worked to restore their ancient prosperity. King Dain received the wizard in the great throne room where once Smaug the Terrible had brooded over his hoard of gold. The dragon's bones had long since been cleared away, but something of the worm's presence lingered still, a sense of vast power held in check, of treasures beyond counting gathered in the mountain's deepest vaults. Gandalf Greyhaim, the Dwarf King said, rising from his throne of carved stone to greet his visitor. Dain was older now than when they had fought together at the Battle of Five Armies, his beard more grey than black, but his eyes still held the fierce light of his people. What brings you to Erebor in such haste? Your message spoke of great peril, but gave few details. The peril is real enough, my lord, Gandalf replied, accepting the seat that was offered to him. Sauron has returned to Dol Guldur, and his servants search far and wide for the ring that was lost at the Gladden Fields. If they find it—" He let the sentence hang unfinished, but Dain understood well enough. The dwarves had their own ancient grudges against the Dark Lord, dating back to the wars of the Elder Days when their greatest smiths had been enslaved in the pits of Angband. "What would you have of us?" the king asked. "Our axes are ever ready to defend the free peoples of Middle-earth, but we are few, and our strength lies in defence rather than attack." "I ask not for warriors, though your valour is renowned throughout Middle-earth," Gandalf said. "I ask for knowledge. Your people have delved deep and travelled far in their trading. If any have heard tales of the ring's fate, if any know secrets of the Gladden Fields that have not been spoken in the halls of men and elves, it would be the dwarves." Dain stroked his beard thoughtfully. "You speak of old sorrows, wizard. The Gladden Fields lie far from our mountain halls, and few of my people have cause to travel those marshes. But," he paused, his eyes growing distant with memory, "there was one, long ago, who claimed to have been there when Isildur fell. A strange fellow, even by the standards of my people, who lived alone in the wild places and came to our markets only to trade for worked gold." "Tell me of him," Gandalf said urgently, leaning forward in his seat. "His name was Daegol, if memory serves, though some called him other things. Smeagol, I think, in the tongue of the river folk. He came to Erebor, perhaps. 400 years past, in the reign of my grandfather's grandfather. A pitiful creature, thin and pale, but his eyes burned with a strange light whenever he spoke of treasures hidden in dark places. The wizard's heart began to race, for this was the first new information he had heard about the ring's fate since beginning his search. What did he tell you? Did he speak of finding anything in the marshes?" "Aye, he did," Dain replied slowly. "Claimed to have pulled something from the riverbed itself, something precious beyond measure. But when pressed for details, he grew secretive and strange, speaking only in riddles and half-truths. My ancestor thought him mad, touched by too many years alone in the wilderness." "Where did he go when he left Erebor? Did he speak of his home, his people?" The Dwarf King shook his head. "He vanished as suddenly as he had come, taking his gold and disappearing into the wild. Some said he dwelt in caves beneath the misty mountains, others that he haunted the marshes where he claimed to have found his treasure. But that was centuries ago, Gandalf. Even if he lived still, which seems unlikely, what could one such as he tell you that would be of use?" But Gandalf was already rising from his seat, his grey robes swirling about him as he paced the throne room with visible excitement. "More than you know, my lord. Much more than you know. This Daegol, if he indeed found the ring in the Gladden Fields, if he has kept it hidden all these years—" "Then Sauron seeks something that has already been found," Dain finished, understanding dawning in his weathered features. "But surely if this creature possessed the ring, its power would have been felt. The wise would have sensed its presence." "Not necessarily," the wizard replied grimly. "The ring has ways of hiding itself, of remaining dormant until the time is right for it to be found. And if its bearer dwells in darkness, away from the light of sun and stars, it might remain hidden even from the keenest sight." The implications were staggering. If the ring lay not at the bottom of Anduin, but in the hands of some wretched creature dwelling in the depths of the earth, then Sauron's search might yet succeed. For the Dark Lord's servants were many, and they knew well how to hunt in the dark places of the world. "I must away," Gandalf said suddenly, his mind already racing ahead to the next stage of his quest. "Thank you, King Dain, for this knowledge. It may prove more valuable than all the gold in your mountain." "Where will you go?" the Dwarf King asked as his guest prepared to depart. "To the Misty Mountains," Gandalf replied, "to search the caves and tunnels beneath their peaks. If this Daegol still lives, if he still possesses what I fear he possesses, then he must be found before Sauron's servants discover him." As he rode away from Erebor on the incomparable Shadowfax, Gandalf felt the weight of destiny settling upon his shoulders like a cloak of lead. The race for the ring had taken on new urgency, and the stakes had grown higher than ever. For if his suspicions proved correct, then the most powerful weapon in Middle-earth lay in the hands of a creature too weak and mad to understand its significance, but not too weak to be tortured into revealing its location. Behind him, the lights of the lonely mountain faded into the distance, but ahead lay only darkness and the unknown perils of the deep places of the earth.